Chapter 32 of Geographical Reader, Europe, by Frank G. Carpenter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Betty B. Chapter 32. In Odessa, General View of Russia. Get out your passports and have your keys ready. We are at anchor in the harbor of Odessa, and the Russian officials are coming aboard. There they are now, just inside the gangway. Those big, black-bearded men in long coats and black caps, with the soldiers beside them. We shall have to show them papers from our government describing just who we are before they will permit us to land. This custom is universal in Russia. All who enter the empire must have passports, and it is impossible to travel through the interior without them. We shall be asked for our passports at every hotel, and our names will be registered at the police stations wherever we stop. We may need them when we buy tickets on the railway and also at the post and telegraph offices. Even the natives must have passports when they leave home, for records are kept of the strangers in every town, so that it is said the Tsar knows just where every man in his empire sleeps every night. We need our keys to open our baggage, that the officers may see that there are no books or papers in it containing articles against the government, and also that we are not smuggling goods into the country. The Russian Empire is so vast, and it has so many different kinds of people, that it is difficult for one man to rule it. It has some citizens who would like to overthrow the government, and for this reason the officials are always on guard. Our passports, however, show that we are good American citizens. We are treated politely. The officials merely look into our trunks, and within a short time we have received permission to enter the city and are riding in our droskies over the paved streets of Odessa to the hotel. How strange everything is! We seem to be in a new world. The people are different, and even the horses look queer, as they trot along with great yokes above them, drawing all sorts of odd vehicles. Notice the drosky in which we are riding. It is about half as big as one of our carriages. Its wheels are no larger than those of a bicycle, and its floor is about a foot from the ground. A big black horse is harnessed to the shafts, which end at the front in a yoke, rising a foot and a half above his neck. There are no tugs. The shafts are fastened to the collar just under the yoke. What an odd-looking driver! He weighs about 300 pounds, and his long navy blue gown, tied with a red sash at the waist, makes him look bigger. His hat is bell-shaped, and his long black beard hangs far down on his breast. He is proud of his size, for to have a fat coachman is the sign of prosperity, and it is said that many of the gowns of the drosky drivers are padded and quilted, and that some even have little pillows inside them to make their owners look fat. Our man holds his arms straight out in front of him as he drives. He slaps the horse with the reins to make him go faster, and stops him by saying "Brrr" instead of "Whoa." Now look at the people on the streets. What a variety of curious costumes! Odessa is the chief city of southern Russia, and men from all the countries about come here to trade. There are Turks and Armenians in fez caps and dark clothes. There are Greek sailors wearing gay jackets, white petticoats, and red shoes turned up at the toes. There are fierce-looking Circassians in high caps of astrakhan fur, and merchants from Persia in turbans and gowns. There are Russians everywhere. We know them by their big frames and fine faces. The men are tall and broad-shouldered, and most of them have long, thick beards. The women are tall, handsome, and stately. Many are very well dressed, although the peasant women wear rough shoes, bright cotton gowns, and have handkerchiefs bound around their heads. What a lot of caps, long coats, and top boots! Every man and boy is thus clad. The soldiers wear caps, the officers wear caps, and so do the common people. Even little boys have visored caps and overcoats, just like their fathers, and some very little girls wear caps of bright silk. How queer the stores are! The signs are in the strange Russian letters, so different from ours that we cannot tell what they mean. There is a newsboy crying his papers. The printing upon them looks as strange as the Chinese characters on tea boxes, and we cannot understand the jargon he utters. We can't even talk with our driver, and are glad when we reach the hotel where the porter speaks English. He acts as our interpreter, giving us rooms and arranging our meals. Next day we take a guide and explore Odessa. It is the chief grain port of South Russia and has a vast trade. We visit the wharves and the chief business sections, and then take the train for our long ride through Russia in Europe. Russia is by far the largest country in Europe and one of the largest of the whole world. The Russians have more land than any other nation except the British. They own more than half of all Europe and considerably more than one-third of all Asia. Their possessions in Asia are almost as big as the whole of South America, and in Europe they have two-thirds as much land as the United States without Alaska, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico. Altogether they have more than one-seventh of all the land surface of the globe. Our travels at present are to be confined to Russia in Europe, and even this is so vast, as we see by the space it has on the map, that we might travel a year and not visit every part of it. Still, a rapid run through it, stopping in the great cities and spending some time in the villages and on the farms, will give us a good idea of the country and people. Let us first take a bird's eye view of European Russia. It consists of a vast plain hemmed in by the Ural Mountains on the east and by the Baltic Sea, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Roumania on the west, extending from the Arctic Ocean to the Black Sea and Caspian Sea, and nowhere having any hills over 1,100 feet high. The chief hills, except those at the extreme south, lie just north of the center of Russia, where the land rises, making a watershed from which the rivers flow north and south, furnishing water to the most of the plain, and giving a cheap means of carrying goods from one part of it to another. Many of the rivers are connected by canals, and as we shall see later, the country has an excellent system of commercial waterways. If a bird should start at the Arctic Ocean and fly clear across Russia to get the view we are taking, it would start upon a coast which is bordered with vast morasses or cold swamps called tundras. Everything there is bleak and dreary. The trees are stunted, and the only human beings to be seen are the strange Lapps and Samoyeds, semi-savages with light yellow faces, high cheekbones, and eyes somewhat slanting. They live in bark tents and look not unlike the Laplanders we saw in Norway, and they have much the same habits, roaming about with their reindeer, grazing them on the mosses and the lichens which grow on the tundras. Passing this region, the bird would fly southward for hundreds upon hundreds of miles over vast forests. It would go for days over nothing but trees, trees, trees. Now and then it might see a bear, a deer, or a wolf, but seldom anything human. In this forest zone of Russia there are thousands of square miles which are entirely uninhabited, where there are no railroads, and where all nature is as wild as it was in our country in the days when the Indians owned it. At the north the trees are chiefly stunted pines, but farther south there are magnificent beeches, firs, and other valuable timber. The forests cover two-fifths of the country, extending, with some clearings here and there, even as far south as Moscow. Coming out of the trees, our bird would next pass over a well-populated region, which produces vast quantities of barley, flax, and hemp, and then enter the third zone, the famous Black Earth zone of Russia. This is a vast plain which stretches from the Carpathian Mountains clear across to the Urals, and which is covered with some of the richest soil on the face of the globe. The land is a thick sheet of black earth, a sort of half mold, from 3 to 20 feet deep, so rich that it has yielded good crops of wheat for many generations without fertilization. This is the best part of Russia and the chief source of its wealth, producing large quantities of grain for export. The country here is well populated. It has cities and towns and countless farm villages. Beyond this there are lands producing Indian corn, and farther south, bordering on the edge of the Caucasus Mountains and the Black and the Caspian Seas, are other plains or steppes which are not so rich, but upon which wild grasses grow in great luxuriance, where vast herds of horses, cattle, and sheep are to be seen. Such is a rough idea of European Russia: great flat plains of cold swamps, of mighty forests, of rich farms and pastures, of a few large cities and a vast number of villages. We shall visit the chief cities later on. Odessa is about as large as Detroit. So, too, is Kiev, just north of it, on the Dnieper, surrounded by a rich farming country. Warsaw in Poland is bigger than St. Louis, and Lodz than Cincinnati, while Riga is of about the size of Minneapolis. St. Petersburg has more people than Philadelphia, and Moscow is almost as large. In addition to these important places, there are other cities ranging in size from 300,000 to 50,000, and there are many still smaller. But we shall see all this better as we go on with our travels. Russia has the longest railroads in the world, and there are steamers on all the chief rivers, so that we can visit the principal parts of the country. Our train from Odessa takes us rapidly northward. The road is smooth and well built. The track is as well kept as our gardens. We often see women on their knees pulling the grass from between the ties, and every few miles there are men working on the railroad. At each road crossing a barefooted, bareheaded peasant girl in a dress of bright colors stands waving a flag to warn the people back while the train passes, and at every station a tall guard in uniform, with a pistol on his hip and a long sword at his side, walks up and down the platform. He is the representative of the Czar, and he wears the Czar's uniform, a red cap with a tall feather in it, a long overcoat, and high boots with spurs. There are many things about the trains that are different from ours. Look out as we go around this curve and see the dense black smoke pouring out of the engine. That comes from the petroleum which is used as fuel, because the oil fields about the Caspian Sea make it cheaper than coal in this treeless region. Farther north, in the forest zone, the smoke will become a light blue, for our locomotive will make steam with wood. We shall have great racks filled with wood just back of the engine. It will keep 2 firemen busy throwing it into the furnaces, while at every few stations we shall see acres of wood piles. Our cars are by no means uncomfortable. We are riding first class on an express train. We have seats near the windows, and our fellow passengers are officials and well-to-do Russians, many of whom speak English and tell us much of their country and people. Every now and then we pass a slower train, largely composed of second and third-class cars. The second-class cars are more cheaply furnished than those of the first class. They are patronized by the merchants and the richer of the common people. The third-class cars are not much better than cattle cars. The seats are rude benches, and they are crowded with peasants. Notice that train which is waiting there on the side track. It is filled with long-bearded, shock-haired men in rough cotton clothes, and with women in short cotton gowns of bright colors, with shawls and handkerchiefs tied around their heads. The men wear caps, and they have boots of felt or leather. The shoes of many of the women are of straw, and in place of stockings they have rags tied around their legs. Each man has a great bundle beside him or under his feet. That is his baggage. In the third class, the most of the baggage is taken into the cars. At some of the depots we see the people using their bundles as pillows, sleeping on the stones while they wait for the train. Take a look at the station where our train is stopping. It has a stone platform, and the building is large and well kept. That bell against the wall is for starting the train. The station has an excellent restaurant. The Russians are fond of good living. They are always eating, and tea, cake, and fruit are brought to our window at every station. The tea is served in glass tumblers, with 2 or 3 lumps of sugar and a slice of lemon, but without milk. We try to drink it in the approved Russian fashion. We squeeze the lemon into the tea, and then putting the hard sugar lump between our teeth, slowly suck the tea through it. It tastes good, but we soon go back to our old way of drinking, for the custom ruins the teeth, and we notice that many Russians on this account have teeth which are badly decayed. The Russians drink more tea perhaps than any other people, and every family has its samovar filled with hot water. The samovar is a brass urn with a pipe running through its center, in which burning charcoal keeps the water hot, so that by turning a spigot fresh tea can be made at any time of the day. There are samovars at all the stations, and the tea peddlers behind them are long-haired, long-bearded men, with faces as rosy, fat, and jolly as that of old Santa Claus. We are a long time crossing the steppes of southern Russia. We pass vast herds of cattle and horses watched by Russian cowboys, and see large flocks of sheep, some of which are tended by women and children. Now we go through a region of vineyards, and again through fields of Indian corn, barley, and rye. As we travel northward, the country grows better and the land more densely populated, until at last we reach the black earth zone. We are now in the Granary of Russia, which produces a large part of the food of the empire, and which in good seasons grows so much wheat that it forms our chief competitor in the food markets of Europe. End of chapter 22. Chapter 33 of Geographical Reader, Europe, by Frank G. Carpenter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Betty B. Chapter 33. The Russian Peasants, a Nation of Villages. We are now in the Great Black Plain, in one of the regions where we can best study the people of Russia. This vast empire may be compared to a huge farm, for the Russians are largely a nation of farmers. The Russian people are made up of the emperor and his officials, of comparatively few nobles, of a few million merchants and artisans who dwell in the cities, and a vast number of peasants living in villages surrounded by farms. The most important part of Russia is village Russia. The country contains about 100 million peasants who live in 500,000 villages. Let us stop a moment and try to realize what this means. There are so many of these peasants that if all the men, women, and children of all the world could be gathered into one place, 1 in every 15 would be a Russian peasant farmer. In our ride to the Black Earth Zone from Odessa, we have not seen a single house by itself in the fields. There were no fences marking off the farms as in America, and no barns nor haystacks standing alone. Excepting the cowboys and the shepherdesses watching the flocks, we did not see a person alone in the fields. The people were working in gangs of from half a dozen to 100, going out together in the morning and coming back in the same way at night. At every few miles we passed little groups of thatched huts, and we could see other huts in groups dotting the country on both sides the track. Each collection of huts was a Russian village, a type of the thousands of villages in all parts of European Russia, and even in the newest settlements of Siberia as well. But let us get off at this station and visit one of the villages. That man over there in the long overcoat, cap, high boots, and sword is the government guard. He puts his hand to his cap and makes a military salute as we accost him. He gives our guide the proper directions, and within a short time we are driving at full speed over the fields. Our vehicle is a sort of boat-like tub on wheels, to which 3 horses are fastened. One horse is inside the shafts, and the others, one on each side, are hitched to bars which extend from the ends of the axle of the front wheels. The carriage and team look sorry enough, and we get in with much fear and trembling. We have hardly taken our seats, however, before the driver cracks his whip and the horses go off at great speed. The one in the shafts trots at a 4-minute pace, and those outside go on the gallop, so that we fairly fly through the air. The road is right over the fields, and we drive through green and yellow oceans of rye and wheat, which are moving up and down in billows under the winds. We cross long fields of yellow sunflowers and go on through meadows where hundreds of sheep are feeding, watched by shepherds who lean on their staffs and gaze at us in wonder. At last we come to our village. It has but one long street lined with straggling thatched huts. There are no sidewalks, and the street is a wide grass plot, except in the middle, where the carts have cut deep ruts in the earth. There are trees here and there on each side of the roadway. Under one of them a woman is knitting, with her children about her. She has tied a box in which lies her baby to one of the branches above her, and she swings it now and then as she works. Farther down on the other side of the street are some frowsy-headed, barefooted boys and girls playing. As we stop they stand and stare at us, while the dogs run out and bark, showing their teeth. Take a look at the huts. Few of them have gardens about them. There are no fences to shut them off from their neighbors or from the road. The average home is a one-story log cabin about 20 feet square, roofed with straw thatch about 1.5 feet thick. Where wood is scarce, the huts are often made of woven twigs plastered with mud. A few of the larger houses have barns or stables joined to them in an L at the rear, so that the animals and people live under the same roof. Let us enter one of the little homes. They are all made the same way, each having 2 rooms and a loft. We first go into an anteroom which is used as a storeroom and stable. There is harness hanging upon the walls, farming tools lie upon the floor, and bags of corn are piled up in a corner. A chicken runs between our legs as we enter, and a calf at the back looks as though it might do the same. Passing through this room, we reach the other room of the house. Indeed, it might be called the only room, for the first is little more than a vestibule, while this room serves as kitchen, dining room, bedroom, and parlor. At one side of it there is a brick stove, or oven and chimney combined, so built up from the floor that there is a ledge 4 feet wide and about 6 feet long just over the oven and under the ceiling. In the oven the cooking is done, and that ledge above it is the common bed of the family. There in the winter as many can crawl in and sleep on the hot bricks while the others lie on the floor. There are no bedsteads and little or no bedclothing. The whole family huddle together like so many sheep, men and women, boys and girls, babies and grandparents, all bunched in together. They sleep in the same clothes they wear in the daytime, and rely largely upon their own animal heat and the oven to keep themselves warm. As we enter, our host asks us to be seated, and we look around for chairs. There are only 2 to be seen, but we take seats on the benches which run around the wall. There is a bare table at one side of the room, and the man asks us to stay and have dinner with him. We do so, and watch his wife lay the table. She does this very quickly, for they use no tablecloth, and no plates, knives, or forks. All she does is put a wooden basin, about as big as a common tin wash basin, filled with cabbage soup, in the center of the board, and lay some wooden spoons beside it. We are hungry after our jolting ride over the fields, and the soup gives forth an appetizing odor as it smokes away on the table. The woman now motions us to draw up our benches. We sit down with the family. We are each given a wooden spoon, about as big as the largest tablespoon, and are told to dip in. We are at a loss how to begin until our host puts in his spoon and conveys some soup to his mouth. We do likewise, each dipping in turn until the basin is empty. In addition to the soup, we each have black bread and raw cucumbers. There is no butter, and the meal seems plain and scanty, after our luxurious living at the Russian hotels. Still, such is the common everyday food of millions of Russians. Some of the peasants have cows and chickens, and hence milk and eggs. Now and then they may have a little fish or meat, but as a rule, if they have cabbage soup and bread, they think they do very well. We are surprised to find how many people live in one hut. Sometimes as many as 12 live in one room. The most of the Russian peasants are poor, and very few save money. They do not seem to care for the future, and live from hand to mouth, so that if a bad season occurs, a famine ensues, and they die by the thousand. If you tell them they should save, for bad times may come, they will say, "Oh, God and the Czar will provide." The Russian peasants have but few wants. If a man has a suit of sheepskin for the winter, and of cotton for the summer, with perhaps an extra suit for Sundays and holidays, he is quite content. In the hot weather he wears a red calico shirt outside his white or blue cotton trousers. The trousers are fastened by a string around the waist, and are often bound in just below the knees with rags, which wrapped around and round the legs and feet serve also for stockings. The richer peasants wear leather boots and long overcoats of cloth or skin. The poor have felt boots for winter and slippers of woven grass or bark for summer. The woman's dress consists chiefly of a bright-colored handkerchief which is tied round the head so that one corner falls down over the neck at the back, a loose gown of white, red, or blue cotton cut low at the neck, which reaches almost to her ankles, and an apron gathered in at the waist and extending down to her knees. A pair of rag stockings and straw or bark shoes completes the costume. The dress of both women and men varies considerably in different parts of the empire. One of the oddest things in our village is the bathhouse. The peasants do not wash often, but when they do they boil or steam themselves clean. They get into an oven-like bathhouse which is filled with steam, and remain there until they have perspired the dirt out of their pores. They look parboiled when they come out, but the steam makes them really much cleaner than a bath in warm water would. In the cities there are large public baths containing many steam rooms. The peasants are very religious. We shall find churches in every district, and in every hut we enter a candle is burning away under an icon, or a painting of the Saviour, the Virgin Mary, or one of the saints. The peasant always says a prayer when he starts out to work. He says a prayer and crosses himself whenever he passes a church, and he crosses himself when he stops work to go home. He would not think of living in a house without one of the holy pictures on his walls, and he often makes pilgrimages to shrines and churches which are considered especially sacred. The most of the peasants are uneducated. Very few of them can read and write, although of late schools for peasant children have been established in the different parts of the empire. The peasants are much like children. They call the Czar father, and look up to him with reverence. They were for a long time in a state of serfdom to the nobles. They were almost the same as slaves, and it was only at about the time of our civil war that the Czar made them free. They are gradually growing more and more independent, and at some time will probably form a very strong and great nation. The peasants own about one-third of the cultivated lands of Russia, but they hold this land in a curious way. In the United States every farmer has his own farm, and he plants his crops and pays his taxes without asking questions of anyone. In Russia each village owns a large block of land in common, and the taxes are paid by the village and not by the individual. Each village is known as a mir. This word means world, for each village is a little world in itself. The mir is supposed to own the houses and lands of the village, and to divide them up among the people from year to year, each person having an equal right to the whole. Every family keeps its house and a little strip of ground, but the lands outside are divided among and farmed by the people in common. This is the reason we saw no one working alone in the fields. The men, women, and older children all go out together to sow, reap, and bring in the crops. The village authorities fix the times for sowing and reaping. They appoint leaders for the people at work and say just when to begin. The villagers elect their own officers, and as to local matters they govern themselves. They choose their own judges and policemen and can punish wrongdoers. The village assemblies and elections take place in the open air, when the people discuss among themselves all matters relating to their crops and their government. Several such villages constitute a volost, containing about 2,000 householders, each village electing members to the district council, which chooses the officers for the district. The districts of each province in turn send representatives to a provincial assembly composed of not only the peasants, but the nobles as well. All are elected, so you see the Russians largely govern themselves, although the Czar appoints the governors of the provinces, and his authority is over all. The Russian peasants are very fond of this village system, and a man will not leave his mir, for he does not want to lose his right to the property owned by his village. If he can save money, he can buy lands outside this, but as a rule the peasants have only the lands which they hold in common. End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of Geographical Reader, Europe, by Frank G. Carpenter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Betty B. Chapter 34. In St. Petersburg. Stand with me on the dome of St. Isaac's Cathedral and take a look at the great city of St. Petersburg. We have been traveling for days to the northward, and are at last in the capital of the Russian Empire, on the Neva River not far from the Baltic. We have driven in our droskies from our hotel down the Nevsky Prospect, the chief street of the city, and along the banks of the Neva to this mighty church. We have climbed around and around up the 500 steps inside its dome, and we now stand on its topmost point, 300 feet above the earth, in one of the most curious cities of the world. Below us, on every side, extends a vast plain of houses, cut up by the great river Neva and the many canals. Off in the distance, at the west, we can see the fortifications of Kronstadt at the mouth of the river on the Gulf of Finland, and in front of us are beautiful islands dotted with the homes of the nobles, while at our back, both to the right and the left, stretches the city. The country about is composed of swamps and morasses. There are great woods and fields to be seen here and there, and everywhere the silvery river and canals sparkle under the rays of the sun. The city is a vast plain of 2, 3, and 4-story houses, built of brick or stone, plastered with yellow stucco, and roofed with iron plates painted dark brown. It is laid out in acute angles, and here, from the dome of St. Isaac's, it looks like an immense crazy quilt of brown diamond-shaped patches, sewed together with white streets and tied with knots of white chimneys. What a lot of chimneys! There are hundreds to every square, and every house is dotted with them. St. Petersburg is far to the northward. It is covered with ice and snow throughout the winter, and the sparks fly up those chimneys from November until May. It is so cold that the houses have double windows, and every room has its enormous porcelain stove, such as we saw in Berlin. Notice how solidly the city is built, and what a space each building covers. The Neva is walled with stones, and the great houses seem founded on rocks. They are so large that they cover a mighty area. That crazy quilt is 25 miles in circumference, and many of its block-like patches are as big as a good-sized farm. The vast houses are built in flats or apartments, as in Paris, Berlin, and Vienna, but the rooms are much larger, and the buildings cover more space. Here and there we can see a great palace belonging to one of the nobles. That red structure on the banks of the Neva, at the end of the Nevsky Prospect, is the Winter Palace, where the emperor holds his receptions. It has rooms which are larger than a good-sized house, and its halls are so wide that you could turn a 4-horse wagon load of hay inside them without touching the walls. It has so many rooms that the emperor does not know what is going on in all of them, and it is said that the servants once rented some of them as a stable, and that when a great fire occurred, a cow and a goat were dragged out with the furniture. Now let your eyes run along the Nevsky Prospect. That is the widest avenue of St. Petersburg and its chief business street. Many of the enormous buildings upon it are palaces. Others are stores and great bazaars which are filled with hundreds of merchants. On the opposite side of the Neva you can see immense wholesale houses extending for miles along the quays, while the river and its canals filled with shipping make you think of the views from the tower of the palace in Amsterdam. But what are those immense golden mounds which rise above the buildings in different parts of the city? Some have tall spires painted in the brightest of colors. Those are Russian churches and cathedrals. They are among the grandest of Europe, some having cost many millions of dollars. Notice this church of St. Isaac's, upon which we are standing. Its dome is almost as big as that of the Capitol at Washington, and it is made of copper plated with gold. It took 200 pounds of solid gold to cover it, and the cathedral itself has cost about $20 million. Let us descend and go through the church. It is like walking through a museum. It has so many beautiful things in marble, precious stones, and gold carvings. The cathedral floor covers almost 2 acres. It is of many colored marbles, and the walls are of marble inlaid with gold carvings. Only a rich man in America can own a table of malachite, and we sometimes see jewel boxes and breastpins of that precious stone. In St. Isaac's, on the 2 sides of the altar, there are 8 columns of malachite, each as high as a 3-story house. There are also 2 pillars of lapis lazuli, while the fence about the altar is of golden posts set into a railing of the purest white marble. The Kazan Cathedral, not far away, has a balustrade of solid silver about its altar, while the Cathedral of St. Peter and St. Paul blazes with gold, and its mighty golden spire can be seen for miles around. There are scores of other churches here in St. Petersburg. There are chapels in all parts of the city, and it is the same in the other great cities of Russia. Wherever we go, all over the country, we shall find churches and chapels. The Russians are very religious. It is the same in the large towns as we found in the villages. Every man has a picture of the Saviour, of the Virgin Mary, or of a saint in his house, and every person crosses himself and says his prayers many times a day. The chief religion of Russia is that of the Greek Orthodox Church. The Emperor himself is the head of the church, and there are priests by the thousands all over the country. They dress in black gowns, wear their hair long, and have high caps on their heads. They are appointed by the Emperor in connection with the Holy Synod, which aids him in managing the church. There are, however, other churches in Russia, for the empire is so vast that it has all sorts of religions. It has many Roman Catholics, and in Finland many Lutherans. There are numerous Mohammedans along the Volga and in southern Russia, and hundreds of thousands of Jews in western Russia and Poland, Chinese Confucianists and Buddhists in the east, and in the Caucasus Mountains there are many Armenians. From St. Isaac's Cathedral we take droskies and drive to the great government buildings. Some of them are larger than the biggest apartment buildings of Washington, and as we ride on through one magnificent street after another, we are more and more amazed at the solidity of the great Russian capital. And still St. Petersburg is built on a swamp. Its very existence is an evidence of the strength of character of the Russians. The other great capitals we have seen have arisen largely from commercial and manufacturing reasons growing out of their situation. London is at the head of navigation of the Thames. Paris is on the Seine, in the center of manufacturing and commercial France. Venice grew up on account of the shipping trade of the Adriatic, and Amsterdam and Rotterdam were built up because they were the commercial centers of the seafaring Dutch nation. St. Petersburg was formed at the command of Peter the Great by a people who lived far away from it in the interior, and who had no reason for building it except the command of their ruler. Peter the Great had traveled through the different countries of Europe in order to study how he might better govern his people and make the most of the great Russian Empire. He visited Holland and England and other countries, where he saw how the seaports helped build up a nation, and how valuable the navy was for its defense. While away he learned shipbuilding, and he came back determined that his country must have both a seaport and a great navy. He could not start his men of war out from the Black Sea because he was shut off by Turkey, which held then and still holds the Bosporus, the only passage out to the Mediterranean. The lands along the Arctic Ocean were too far away and too cold, and so he chose this place on the Gulf of Finland at the mouth of the Neva. He was not alarmed because it was swampy, nor did he fear because it was covered with woods. He said to himself, "Here I will erect my seaport and my capital." Peter's command went forth, and at his word, like magic, this great stone city sprang into being. Piles by the millions were driven down to make the foundation. The river Neva was held back by walls of granite, and every Russian subject was called upon to do something to build the new capital. Every noble in the land was ordered to build a house in St. Petersburg, and every Russian who owned 500 serfs had to put up a two-story house, no matter whether he lived on the edge of the Caspian Sea or on the border of the Ural Mountains. Every vessel on the Russian rivers and every Russian ship on the Baltic had to bring a load of stones to aid in building the city, and all the peasants nearby were ordered to help. 40,000 men were drafted every year to aid in the work, and nobles as well as peasants dug out the foundations and built up the houses. Even the criminals from prisons were made to toil here under the guns of the guards, and through it all the emperor lived in a little house by the river and watch the building. This house still stands, and we drive across the Neva to see it. It is so small that it would hardly be noticed if it were placed in the great ballroom of the Winter Palace. It contains 2 rooms and a kitchen, and is not unlike one of the cabins of our forests of Wisconsin and Michigan. The Russians reverence it as the home of their great emperor, and they have built another house over it, that it may withstand the weather. As we walk through it, we can hardly realize that when it was built, less than 200 years ago, the wolves howled in the woods all about it, and that now more than 100 million people look upon it as the chief place upon earth. Leaving this lowly hut, we again cross the Neva to visit the palaces and government departments and learn more about the Russia of today. We find that the emperor has still nominally almost as much power as had Peter the Great, although in reality he rules largely through his cabinet ministers and state council representing the provinces. We have learned that there are 79 states in the Russian Empire, each of which has some officials appointed by the Czar, but most of which are more largely ruled by the people themselves. We learn that the empire contains the enormous number of about 130 million people, and of these more than 100 millions live in Russia. The European Russians are chiefly of the Slav race, but there are many other races in different parts of the country, and more than 30 different peoples in the Caucasus alone. At the War and Navy departments we are shown that the Russians have a great navy, and that their army is one of the strongest of the world. And at other offices are told that the government is doing its best to develop the enormous natural resources of the empire by building railroads, opening mines, and encouraging the people in all sorts of manufacture and trade. Russia is also rapidly developing its vast possessions outside Europe. Railroads are building in Siberia and Central Asia, which have opened up rich territories in that continent. Mines of gold, silver, iron, and coal are being worked, and vast tracts of grain and cotton are cultivated. Many thousand Russian peasants emigrate to these countries every year, so that in time much of Asia will be populated by the Slav race. We make excursions north into Finland, traveling through the woods by hundreds of beautiful lakes, and also along the coast, where there are fjords like those of Scandinavia. The inhabitants remind us of the Swedes, although there are some people in the extreme north, known as Finns, who are of the yellow race. The people, Finlanders, everywhere are different from the Russians, although they are ruled by the Czar, who has the title of the Grand Duke of Finland. They have a senate at Helsingfors, where they make their own laws and have to some extent a government of their own. The Finlanders are chiefly farmers, dairymen, and lumbermen. They are far more thrifty and better educated than the Russians. They have neat villages made of log cabins, and some fine cities such as Helsingfors, the capital, which lies on the Gulf of Finland, having an excellent harbor. Another trip takes us to Warsaw on the Vistula in Russian Poland. Here the inhabitants are almost all Poles. They are a high-spirited people who for a long time had a kingdom of their own. They had some of the best lands of Europe, but the Russians and Prussians, who coveted their property, made war upon them and conquered them, and divided up Poland, so that Russia now has here a state about as large as New York, with a soil fully as rich. The Poles still keep their own language and customs, but they are ruled by the Czar. They have many large towns, Warsaw being the 3rd city in size of the whole Russian Empire. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of Geographical Reader, Europe, by Frank G. Carpenter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Betty B. Chapter 35, Moscow, Commercial and Manufacturing Russia. A day's ride from Warsaw has brought us to Moscow, the commercial capital of the great Russian Empire. The city stands right in the heart of European Russia, on the navigable Moscow River, which connects it with the Oka and Volga. It has easy access by rail to the Don, Dnieper, and Dwina rivers, and it is so situated that it is the chief railroad center of Russia. It is in the most densely populated part of the empire, and its situation especially fits it for the center of Russian manufacture and trade. It has more than 1,000 factories in and about it, and the smokestacks rise here and there above the city, rivaling in height the golden spires of its churches. The factories employ more than 250,000 workmen, and turn out a product worth several $100 millions per year. A great quantity of goods of all kinds is required to supply the vast population of Russia, and the factories are rapidly growing in number. There are now more than 100,000 in the empire, and more are being built. There are many cotton, linen, woolen, and flour mills in Russian Poland. There are factories of all kinds in St. Petersburg, and also in Odessa, and along the Volga River, while there are many little silk mills in the Caucasus Mountains. Not far south of Moscow is Tula, the Sheffield of Russia, where are the great gun factories which supply the Russian army, and enormous railroad shops and works for making knives, tools, and machinery. In Moscow there are vast cotton mills, sugar mills, and establishments which turn out almost everything made of wood, iron, and steel. The chief workshops of Russia, however, are in the homes of the people, the product made there annually amounting in value to more than $500 millions. 6/7 of all the goods made are the result of such house industry, for the peasants are everywhere working at their trades in their homes. Nearly every Russian village has its specialty. In some the people spin yarn and weave cloth, and in others they make boots and shoes. There are towns along the Volga which turn out fine axes and knives. Just outside Moscow is a village whose people are noted for beating gold leaf, while near Tula there are 2,000 people who work away in their little houses making accordions. In southern Russia, rugs and carpets as beautiful as those of India and Turkey are woven by hand, and in central Russia there are many thousands who paint icons or pictures of saints, such as we have seen in the houses and stores with candles and incense burning below them. These icons are cut out of plates of carved gold, silver, or brass, only the faces being painted. They are of all sizes and prices, from little ones no bigger than a watch, which sell for a few cents, up to some as big as a barn door, worth thousands of dollars. There are stores in Moscow which sell nothing else, and we can find icon stores in all the large cities. There are some villages in Russia where the people make a business of raising canaries for sale, and some where they raise cats for their skins. The cats bring 5 or 10 cents apiece. They are bought by traveling merchants who ship their skins to the fur markets of the empire. In other villages pigeons are bred for their skins, which are cured with the feathers on and sold at the fairs to be exported to all parts of Europe and our country for decorating ladies' hats and lining fine cloaks. You have all heard of Russian leather. It is prized everywhere for pocketbooks, valises, slippers, and bookbindings. It has a delightful odor from the birch bark employed by the tanners. Much of it is made in small tanneries, and there are hundreds of thousands engaged at their homes making various articles from it, both for export and for sale to the Russians. In some parts of the empire the women wear high boots of soft leather, and every Russian man who can afford it has at least one pair of boots which come up to his knees. There are thousands of women who knit beautiful lace, and Russian velvets are noted all over Europe. The Russians are skillful in making all sorts of things, and some day, when machinery has taken the place of hand labor, they will be one of the greatest of the manufacturing nations. The empire has vast deposits of gold and silver, and of coal, iron, and copper. It has more wood than any other European country. It raises quantities of wool and flax and tobacco, and also in Asia a great deal of cotton, so that it has all the materials for a great manufacturing country. Until a few years ago, the most of the Russian peasants were practically in slavery, and all sorts of work were done in the rudest way. Now the people are introducing modern inventions, and they are establishing large factories with the finest machinery. They are opening up their mines both in Europe and Asia. The government is encouraging improved methods of farming, and the education of the people has begun. They are rapidly growing in intelligence and wealth, and they will continue to grow. Many believe that the two greatest nations of the world of the future will be the Russians and the Americans. But let us take a stroll through the business sections of Moscow. We shall find them different from those of the other great cities we have seen, for Russia is in some respects more like Asia than Europe or the United States. Here we are, in one of the great bazaars which we find in all Russian cities. It is a vast building covering many acres, filled with all sorts of shops, opening out into covered corridors or arcades, so that there are hundreds upon hundreds of stores under one roof. This one bazaar has 1,200 stores. It is a whole town of stores roofed over, and the stores are of all kinds, so that you can buy anything you want, from a slate pencil to a sealskin coat, or from a toothpick to a set of furniture. There are jewelry shops and clothing stores, stores selling leather goods, and stores which deal only in pictures and books. We wander through one arcaded street after another, past beautiful things of all kinds and some of great value, realizing as we do so that Russia must have a large class of rich people to buy goods so very expensive. We are also surprised at the way they do business. When we attempt to purchase, the merchant usually charges us more than he expects to receive, and we must bargain with him if we would pay only a fair price. The result is that we offset his price by an offer of much less, whereupon he comes down a little. We then go up a few cents, and if we hold out, we at last get it perhaps for what we are willing to give. The business hours in the bazaars are from 9 in the morning until 5 in the afternoon. We visit them one day about shutting up time and watch the merchants lock up for the night. Each store facing the street has windows and doors, which are closed tight and then fastened with padlocks. The merchant turns the key and then ties the padlock to the staple, sealing the two ends of the string with hot wax, into which he presses his stamp, so that the store cannot possibly be opened without breaking the seal. He then stands in front of the closed doors and crosses himself, saying a prayer before he leaves for the night. He will probably say another when he opens his shop in the morning. Outside the bazaars there are many stores scattered over the city, some of which have curious signs. They have pictures painted on the walls facing the street, which show what articles are sold within, so that those who cannot read may understand from the pictures. Take, for instance, that barber sign over there on the opposite side of the street. The whole wall of the shop is covered with it. One part of it represents a man in his shirt sleeves shaving a customer, while opposite him is a lady holding out her arm from which a stream of blood is spouting, while a man stands beside her with a knife in his hand. Farther down in the picture sits a boy having a tooth pulled, and the whole sign shows us that the man within is not only a barber, but a dentist and surgeon as well. That store farther on is a feed store. There is a bundle of hay in the doorway, and on the walls at the sides are pictures of horses and cows feeding and grazing. The tea signs represent Chinamen sipping tea, while the dairy signs are pictures of cows with maids milking them. We visit the markets before going back to our hotel. They are of enormous extent, and are filled with the finest of game, meats, fish, and vegetables. The better class Russians are noted for their extravagant living, and the markets of St. Petersburg and Moscow are as good as those of any other European city. Fish may be bought alive. They are kept in stone vats of running water, each filled with its own kind of fish. In the dining rooms of some of the great restaurants there are marble fountains with fishes swimming about in them. You can point out the fish you want for your supper, and the waiter will catch it in a net and cook it for you, and I am sure you will say it is the best fish you ever ate. Russia is noted for fine fish, and it exports quantities of fish and fish eggs every year. The Volga, the Caspian Sea, and the Black Sea have rich fishing grounds, and there are fisheries along the Arctic Ocean and the Baltic Sea. In the markets we see cans, buckets, and tubs of caviar. This is a Russian dainty made of the roe of the sturgeon. Caviar looks like bird shot, but it is in reality the eggs of the sturgeon, which are eaten in great quantities by the people throughout Russia. The fresh caviar is the best, but a great deal of it is canned and thus sold all over the world. After the eggs have been removed, the sturgeon meat is salted, and you can buy it in the market at about 10 cents a pound. There are also stalls where only dried fish is sold. This is eaten by the people everywhere, and it forms a part of the diet of the peasants. The queerest market sights are those of the winter, when almost everything is sold in a frozen state. The Russian winter is so cold that fish and meats can easily be kept frozen for months. The butcher can lay away his beef, mutton, and chickens in October and bring them forth at any time during the winter. The meats are frozen so hard that a knife will not cut them, and they have to be sawed or chopped up with an axe, when it is said splinters of meat fly about in every direction, and the beggars collect them and take them off home. Leaving the markets, we go back to our hotel. It is an enormous structure, having a dining room so large that 1,000 people can be seated in it at one time. The food is excellent, and we find that we can live as well in Moscow as in any other city we have visited. The customs of eating, however, are different from those of the other European countries. The first thing the Russian does upon entering the dining room is to go to a lunch counter, which is always found at one side of the room, where vodka, a Russian liquor, and such relishes as caviar, raw herring, smoked salmon, radishes, butter, and cheese are laid out. He drinks a small glass of the vodka and eats a bit of a relish while standing, and then goes and takes his seat for dinner. The first thing that is served at a regular dinner is soup, and we find the ordinary dish of Russian soup almost a whole meal. One of the most popular kinds is known as Xxxii. Sneeze hard and you will get the right pronunciation. Xxxii is made of cabbage and beef, to which is often added a bowl of sour cream. Each plateful of the soup has a big chunk of beef in the middle, and we are expected first to eat the soup and then to cut up the beef and eat it. There are other soups of all kinds, hot and cold. There is even iced soup, as we discover when we lunch one day at a restaurant. We cannot read Russian and point to the odd letters where the word soup should be on the bill of fare, and ask the waiter for that. He goes to the kitchen and brings a great bowl of white liquid with a piece of ice as big as his fist floating about in it. We try it. It tastes like iced vinegar, and one taste is enough. After the soup, meat and vegetables of various kinds are brought on, and then most delicious desserts. The Russian bread and butter at the better hotels is always good. Leaving the markets, we take droskies and ride about Moscow. It is built upon the hills and hollows which here line the winding Moscow River. It is 25 miles in circumference, and the shortest car line from one side of it to the other is 9 miles long. In the very center of the city is a great fortress or citadel known as the Kremlin, which contains the old palace of the Tsar, several famous Russian churches, the cathedral in which the emperors of Russia are crowned, and the tall tower of Ivan the Great. The tower is 5 stories high, and its golden dome seems to float in the air away up there 300 feet above the ground. There is a stairway in it, and we climb up 450 steps to the top for a view of the city. We are hanging over a vast expanse of trees and houses, out of which rise the golden spires and domes of hundreds of churches. There are thousands of green trees. The roofs of the houses are all painted green, while some of the church domes are of sky blue, spotted with stars of gold. On the opposite side of the river, we can see the golden dome of the Church of Our Savior, and beyond the city the smokestacks of the factories, while just under us is the great triangular walled space known as the Kremlin. It is paved with cobblestones, and its massive wall is entered by 5 gates, each of which has a history. There is the one through which we came. It is called the Gate of the Redeemer, on account of a picture of the Savior above it, and every one, from the Tsar to the peasant, takes off his hat to that picture as he goes through. Every inch of land within the walls of the Kremlin is historic and sacred. In the church below us all the Tsars of Russia have been crowned, and there to the left is the imperial treasury, where are the jewels and the costly plate belonging to the Russian crown. There are hundreds of millions of dollars worth of gold and precious stones in that building. There are basins of gold as big as a footbath, some of the world's greatest diamonds, and 2 tables of solid silver. As we go down from the tower of Ivan the Great, we pass the many bells for which it is noted. Russia is a land of bells, and there are said to be 2,000 in Moscow alone. The largest bell that rings, so large that you cannot get it into an ordinary parlor, hangs within the tower, and there are others, some of which are made of solid silver, but of smaller size. As we come out of the tower, we see at its foot, on a pedestal of stone, the biggest bell ever made. It is as tall as a 2-story house. It is 55 feet in circumference and 2 feet in thickness. A piece taller than a man is broken out of its side, and when we climb up and crawl into the hole where this piece once was, we are in a great tent of bronze. This bell was first cast in the 16th century and was hung in Ivan's tower. The tower burned, and when the bell fell, it was broken in pieces. It was cast again in a larger size, but when the metal was still molten, the women of Moscow, in a religious frenzy, threw their jewelry into the mass, and this rendered it so imperfect that when it was rung a great piece broke out of its side. Then there was another fire, and the bell fell once more, never to rise again. From the Kremlin we visit the great church of Our Savior, built to commemorate the deliverance of Moscow when the French soldiers under Napoleon invaded the country. The church cost about $40 million, or about 3 times as much as our Capitol at Washington. Later on we spend some time in the Moscow University, which was founded by Peter the Great, and which has now several thousand students. We next drive out to the People's Park, and enjoy ourselves with the Russian children in the roller coasters and merry-go-rounds. We listen to the open-air concerts and drink our tea under the trees. We find that the Russians are fond of enjoyment and pleasure. They have shows of all kinds, and their musicians are among the best of the world. End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of Geographical Reader, Europe, by Frank G. Carpenter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Betty B. Chapter 36. Down the Volga to the Caspian Sea. We are at Nizhny Novgorod, on the river Volga. We have come from Moscow by train, and are now on a bluff overlooking the Volga at the point where the Oka flows into it. Above us, upon a hill, is a great fortress, and behind and about us a city with fine streets, many stores and churches, and large public buildings. It contains 100,000 people, and the noise of its business and traffic makes a din in our ears. Below, on the tongue of land formed by the junction of the Volga and Oka, is another city almost as large, but strange to say, as quiet and deserted as a city of the dead. We cannot see a wreath of smoke coming from its thousands of chimneys. Its many stores are closed, and their shelves have no goods on them. It has theaters, but no actors. Its electric lights have not shone for months, and the grass is growing in its streets. It is the fair city of Nizhny Novgorod, which for about a month in late summer is one of the liveliest trading places in the whole world, but which for the rest of the year is deserted and dead. In the Middle Ages the most of the business of Europe was done in great fairs held at all the principal centers, and visited by buyers and sellers from everywhere. These fairs were usually held once a year, and they often lasted for weeks. They were established because there were but few large cities with stores of all kinds such as are found in Europe today. Most of the people lived in villages, as they still do in Russia. There were no railroads, and but few good wagon roads, and no way of moving rapidly about upon the rivers, so that the people could not go often from one place to another to buy or sell goods. As the means of communication improved and the cities grew, the fairs passed away, but there are still a number in Russia, and now and then one in other parts of Europe, such as Leipzig, where we heard of the book fairs and fur fairs which are still held every year. The principal fair of Russia meets annually in that deserted city below us. Those houses have been built for it. They contain more than 6,000 shops, which a month or so hence will be filled with goods. There will be more than 6,000 merchants selling them, and many, many thousands of purchasers. Then the banks of the Volga for 10 miles above here will be covered with merchandise, and both the Volga and Oka will be crowded with shipping. Vessels from the Caspian Sea will bring raw cotton from Central Asia, and bales of fine wool from South Russia, as well as carpets, rugs, silks, and other such things. Barges of pig iron from Siberia will be floated down from the Ural Mountains, and great loads of brick tea will be carried on camels over the highlands from China. Every variety of goods made in the thousands of factories of Russia will be brought hither, as well as skins, furs, fish, sugar, coffee, rice, and in short almost everything that is made anywhere. Most of the business will be at wholesale, and a vast deal of money will change hands. The customers will be of all the nations and races of Eastern Europe and Southern and Western Asia. One section of the city will be given up to the Chinese, another to the Persians and Turks, and others to the Russians. There will be Georgians and Circassians, Armenians and Romanians, Germans and Hungarians, and merchants from every part of the Russian Empire. There will in all be several 100,000 strangers in the great fair city, and we regret we cannot stay for the sight. We have time for only a drive through the now deserted streets, after which we take the steamer for our long ride down the Volga to the Caspian Sea. How interesting it is! We have steamed out of Nizhny Novgorod and are now moving southward upon the greatest river of Europe. The Volga is 2,300 miles long, and is navigable almost all the way from its source to its mouth. It is one of the great trade routes of Russia, and one of the commercial waterways of the world, including, with its tributaries, more than 7,000 miles of navigable waterways. It is connected by canal with the Neva, so that boats and barges from the Baltic can be taken through that river and the canal into the Volga and carried on down to the Caspian Sea. It has other canals which connect it with the Dwina and the Arctic Ocean, and one joining the Oka to the Don, by which goods can be taken from the Volga up the Oka into the Don and the Black Sea. The river is winding and the scene continually changes. Now we are going north and now south. Now the stream widens, so that we seem to be steaming through a great lake, and now it is narrow and deep with high rugged banks. One day we have a storm, and the water changes from silver to ink, while the winds from the plain sweep in gusts over our vessel. The storm passes and the sun sets in a blaze of red in the western horizon. Every few miles we pass a large village of log huts, and now and then go by a city. There are 40 large cities on the Volga, and more than 1,000 towns and villages. We see many windmills, and everywhere above the towns the spires and domes of the churches. Our first long stay is at Kazan, which we reach about a day and a night after leaving Nizhny Novgorod. It is one of the oldest cities of Russia, having been the capital of the Tartars, when those almond-eyed yellow savages overran Eastern Europe and for 200 years fought for the country with the Slavs. They were finally conquered by the Russians under Ivan the Terrible, but many of the Tartars remained in Kazan, and there are thousands of Tartars in it today. There are 3 now in that crowd on the wharf. You can tell them by their yellow faces and slant eyes. They have caps of black astrakhan fur, and their heads are shaved close, while the Russians have caps with visors and wear their hair long. Farther back is a group of Tartar women. They are queer-looking creatures with sacks over their heads. The Tartars are good Mohammedans, and Mohammedan women seldom show their faces to any men but their husbands. The country is densely populated, and we see children everywhere. Farther down the river we spend an hour in Samara, a large city with many windmills about it, and stop again farther on at Saratov, in a grain-growing region. Everywhere we see rich crops of wheat, barley, and rye. There are miles upon miles of pastures, herds of cattle and horses, and great flocks of sheep, and vast tracts of sunflowers with their great golden blossoms swaying to and fro in the wind. The Russians raise sunflowers for their seeds, and they consider them a very profitable crop. The seeds, when pressed, yield a rich oil which is used for salads and cooking, and also for lighting and making candles and soap. The refuse of the seeds, after the oil is squeezed out, is an excellent food for pigs, cattle, and sheep, and also for rabbits, pigeons, and poultry. The people eat the seeds as we do peanuts, keeping a handful or so in their pockets and nibbling away on them from time to time. There is such a demand for the seeds for various purposes that more than 40,000,000 pounds of them are raised every year. The flowers are rich in honey, and the farmers keep bees which feed upon them. A yellow dye is made from the blossoms, and the stalks have a fiber which the people in some districts use as we do flax. We ask how the sunflowers are raised, and are told that the seeds are sown very late in the fall or in the early spring and harvested in the summer. The seed is drilled in rows about 18 inches apart, and the plants thinned out so that there is a space of a foot or so between them. An acre of plants should yield about 50 bushels of seed. We are interested in the shipping of the Volga. The river is filled with vessels from Nizhny Novgorod to the sea. We go by many passenger steamers, past great barges loaded with grain, and tank ships of petroleum on their way from the oil fields below the Caucasus Mountains to the railroads and factories of the north. We pass enormous rafts of lumber, each with a neat house upon it, where the lumbermen live during the voyage. The rafts come from the northern forests, where the timber was cut, and the lumbermen will sell both timber and houses when they reach their destination in one of the towns of the treeless plains farther downstream. Nearer the shore are small boats towed along from the banks by horses and by red-shirted peasants. There are fishing boats here and there, and other craft of every description. We are more than 4 days on the river before we reach Astrakhan, at the head of the delta of the Volga, where it divides into about 200 mouths and flows on to the Caspian Sea. Here the river is wide. Its volume increases with the floods of the spring, when it becomes a great sea, from 10 to 25 miles broad, for hundreds of miles from its mouth. Even here the Volga is frozen for 3 months, and above Nizhny Novgorod it is covered with ice for 5 or 6 months every year. Astrakhan is the chief port for the Caspian Sea, although it is situated about 80 miles north of it. It is a very old city, largely inhabited by the fishermen of the Caspian, and having a vast trade in fish as well as in wool and other products of the region about it. We visit the establishments where they are putting up caviar for export, and then take steamer for Baku, the chief port of the Russian oil regions on the Caspian Sea. It takes us all day to get to the mouth of the Volga, and we are more than another day in sailing on to Baku. The Caspian is rough, for a storm rises when we are far out from land, and in our little vessel we are rolled about more than we were during our passage across the Atlantic. The Caspian is the largest of all inland seas, and the winds from the Russian steppes roll up immense billows upon it. The water is salt, and the spray which is dashed in our faces makes us think of the ocean. We are now 90 feet below the surface of the Black Sea, which we left at Odessa, and as we near Baku we are in sight of the Caucasus Mountains, the southern boundary of European Russia. When we leave the steamer, we step out onto the soil of Asia, but as the oil fields are closely associated with European Russia, we have decided to include them in our tour. They begin at Baku. The strip in which they are found is only a few miles in width, but it is more than 1,000 miles long. We seem to be steaming through oil as we come into the harbor. The water is coated with it, and there is a strong smell of petroleum from the great tank ships, and from the trains of tank cars as well as from the pipes which bring the oil into the city. We ask for a drink of fresh water, and when it is brought we taste it and then hand it back in disgust, for it has the flavor of kerosene. In Baku much of the cooking is done with oil, and the factories use oil for fuel. The city for a long time was lighted with oil, and everything we see seems mixed with it. The train which carries us through the oil region burns petroleum. We ride for miles through a forest of black towers 60 feet high, each standing above an oil well, and when at last we get out of the cars and walk on the ground, the oil oozes out under our feet. The scenes are somewhat like those of the oil regions of the United States, save that instead of the skeleton-like derricks which stand over our wells, we have here towers like pyramids, boarded up, and as black as though they were covered with pitch. At each tower is a shed for the engine used for boring the well, also for pumping oil. The black on the tower has come from the oil and sand which spouted forth from the well when the oil was first struck. The petroleum of this part of the world is nearer the surface than in our oil fields. Some of the wells are only 200 feet deep, and many are less than 1,000 feet deep. When a good well is first struck, the oil often bursts forth to a great height, falling in a dense shower all about. Sometimes so much oil comes from the fountain wells that it is impossible to save it, and it flows off in streams over the land. Ditches are then dug to carry it to the reservoirs, and we see streams of oil, ponds of oil, and great tanks of oil everywhere. From one well bored some years ago, the oil sprouted up to the height of 400 feet, and it kept spouting for months, so that within less than 2 years it produced enough petroleum to fill a ditch more than a yard wide and 100 miles long, and deep enough to cover the head of a man standing upright within it. As we proceed, we see more and more evidences of the great extent of the Russian oil fields. There are 500 ships on the Caspian Sea which carry nothing but oil. Vast amounts are shipped to Russia and other parts of Europe, and trains of tank cars are always carrying petroleum and kerosene to the Black Sea. From there it is shipped through the Strait of the Bosporus and the Mediterranean Sea to Asia, Africa, South America, and Europe. The United States now sells more oil than any other country, but Russia is competing with it in the markets of the world, and as we ride on and on through these forests of black towers, we wonder whether Russia may not at some time surpass the United States in exporting petroleum. From the oil regions we take a train for Tiflis, the capital of the Russian dominions in Transcaucasia, a territory which is as large as France and which contains more than 8 million people. The city is a beautiful one of about 200,000 inhabitants. It lies in a valley with vineyards about it, with rocky heights farther back, and with many snow-clad peaks far off in the distance. We are now in the heart of the Caucasus Mountains, but on the lower side of the range, and quite a long way from Mount Elburz, the highest of these mountains, and also the highest mountain of Europe. The people of Tiflis are chiefly Asiatics. We see many strange faces and costumes as we ride about the town and shop in the bazaars, and we feel that we might linger for weeks here in Asia had we not a large part of Europe yet to explore. We visit the different quarters of the city, buy a few things of the Persian, Turkish, and Armenian merchants in the markets, and then take the train through the Caucasus to Batum on the Black Sea, where we find a ship which within a few days will land us in Constantinople, the capital of Turkey. End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of Geographical Reader, Europe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty B. Geographical Reader, Europe, by Frank G. Carpenter. Chapter 37. In Constantinople. The Strait of the Bosporus, which connects the Big Black Sea with the Little Sea of Marmora and the Mediterranean, winds in and out through a deep mountain valley which here lies between Europe and Asia. The hills in some places slope almost precipitously down to the water, and in other places great cliffs overhang it. Here and there along the strait are the palaces of the Sultan and of Turkish nobles, interspersed with fishermen's huts and peasant villages, with rich farms and forests. There are castles and fortresses on some of the hills, and the scenery often reminds us of the Rhine and the Danube. The Bosporus is one of the great water highways between Europe and Asia, and vast cargoes of grain, oil, wool, and other products are always passing back and forth through it. The strait is only 19 miles long, but so wide and deep that the largest ocean steamers can easily navigate it. At the southern end of the strait, where it empties into the Sea of Marmora, there is a lofty little peninsula, a tongue of land extending far out and almost blocking the entrance. The northern side of this peninsula is bordered by a horn-shaped inlet, which forms a wide and deep harbor, so covered with rich shipping that it is called the Golden Horn. The peninsula itself is not much larger than a big Texas farm, but it is the site of Constantinople, one of the most beautiful cities of the world. We have learned that there is always a reason for cities being situated just where they are. Even as villages are built at country crossroads to catch the business of the people moving each way, so cities grow up on the great highways of commerce, and especially where such highways cross. This is one of the reasons for the growth of Constantinople. It is at the chief crossroads of Europe and Asia. The grand divisions here come close together, and goods brought in by caravan for Europe can be easily shipped over the narrow strait to Constantinople, from where they can be sent on to the northward. Moreover, Constantinople occupies the best position on the great water road of the Bosporus, which connects the whole world with the Black Sea and all parts of Eastern Europe. The Golden Horn gives Constantinople an excellent harbor, and its situation at the mouth of the Bosporus makes it really the chief port of the Danube, the Dnieper, the Don, and the other great rivers which empty into the Black Sea, and as such it has always had a great trade. The city also has the advantage of being easily defended. There are highlands about it upon which are great fortifications, and forts have been erected along the Dardanelles and the Bosporus, so that the Turks can, if they wish, prevent ships from moving out and in through the strait. The site of Constantinople is so central that a city was founded here more than 2,500 years ago, under the name of Byzantium, which for centuries was a center of commerce and trade. About 1,000 years later, the Emperor Constantine made it the capital of the whole Roman Empire, and called it Constantinople. For many centuries it was a Roman city. Then it was taken by the Crusaders, and in the Middle Ages by the Mohammedan Turks. A few years before Columbus started out on his first voyage to America, the Turks, a yellow race of Tartar Mohammedans who had overrun Asia Minor, captured the city and extended their conquests farther on into Europe, taking country after country along the Danube and elsewhere, until they had almost as much territory as there is in the German Empire of today. They had still larger possessions in Asia than in Europe, but they so liked Constantinople that they chose it for the capital of their empire, and it holds this position today, although the greater part of their European territories have been taken from them. But we are now at the end of the Bosporus, right in front of the city. Our ship is slowly steaming in and out among craft of all kinds. The Golden Horn in front of us is filled with vessels of every description, and there are hundreds of little caiques, or Turkish gondolas, containing passengers and pleasure hunters moving in all directions. Steam launches and tugs are darting in and out through the shipping. The boats are manned by queerly dressed sailors, and all our surroundings are strange. We are on the water, but nevertheless almost in the midst of the great city of Constantinople. There on the right bank of the Golden Horn are the marble palaces of the Sultan, some high up on the hill and others on the edge of the water, while farther on are the houses and business structures of Pera, where the most of the Europeans live. At the left, on the opposite bank of the Bosporus, a village of pink houses of curious shapes rises out of green trees. That land is Asia, and the town is Scutari, the suburb of Constantinople, where the largest of the Turkish cemeteries is located, and where many Turks who do business in Constantinople live. Before us on the peninsula is spread out the main part of the city, known as Stambul, which contains the vast bazaars, the hundreds of mosques, and the dwellings of most of the million and more who make up the population of this great Turkish capital. As we come closer, the city appears to rise straight up from the sea. There is a low, ruined wall about it, built centuries ago, but back of this are palaces, here and there on the edge of the water, surrounded by green. The city is made up of hill and hollow, and as it lies before us it is a vast rolling expanse of houses, with huge domes and tall white towers extending high above them. Each of those domes is on the roof of one of the great Mohammedan churches or mosques, some of which cover acres, and the white towers are their minarets. The minarets have galleries about them in which, with our glasses, we can see dark-faced men in turbans and gowns standing as they call the people to prayer. We can hear their shrill tenor voices coming over the water, and we see the Mohammedans on our ship turn toward the south in the direction of Mecca, their holy city, and kneel down and bend their heads to the deck as they utter their prayers. Now we have entered the Golden Horn and landed at Pera. We have walked through the business part of the city and gone down to the bridge of boats, which is the main highway across to Stamboul. We have paid our toll to the tall Turk in turban and gown at the entrance, and are standing on the bridge, gazing at the strange throngs that are moving back and forth on their way to and from the great city. Constantinople is a mixture of many strange races. It has more Turks, perhaps, than any other people, but there are thousands of Armenians, Persians, Circassians, Greeks, Georgians, and Jews, as well as strange characters from all parts of Europe and southwestern Asia. There are scores of men in long gowns with white, red, blue, or green turbans about their heads. They wear red or yellow slippers turned up at the toes, which clap on the boards as they walk. Their faces are dark, and their eyes somewhat slanting. Many have long beards which reach down their breasts. Most of those who dress in this way are Turks, and all are Mohammedans. There are also hundreds of dark-faced men wearing clothes like ours, but with red fez caps on their heads, and there are boys in red caps and long gowns. But what are those two curious creatures now coming toward us? As they enter the bridge in the distance, each looks like two mammoth sausages tied together, one on top of the other. Those are two Turkish women who have their heads and faces so wrapped up that they hardly seem human. Their dresses look like balloons, for their outer clothing hides their forms as they walk through the street. Now they are closer, and we see that each wears a veil, so that only the eyes and a strip of the forehead are visible. One of the women has a black servant with her, a slave who is going along to guard and protect her. Mohammedan women do not show their faces on the street, and indoors they are rarely seen by any other men than their husbands. Get out of the way of that porter. Don't you see the enormous box he is carrying on his back, bending over so that he can hardly look up? He is one of the drays of Constantinople, and he competes with the donkey and the camel for his share of the freight. There are but few heavy vehicles in the city. Trunks and boxes of all kinds are carried about by the porters, called hamals, who rest their burdens on saddles fastened to their backs. Some of them are so strong they can carry as much as 500 pounds at one load. But let us walk over the bridge, keeping close to the railing and out of the way of the carriages, donkeys, and camels, and of the turbaned soldiers riding Arabian horses. We walk behind a Greek priest, who strolls along arm in arm with a Circassian in uniform, wearing a high cap of astrakhan fur. As we go on, we are accosted by beggars in turbans. We pass peddlers and hucksters dressed in all the colors of the rainbow and selling all kinds of goods. We stop one for a drink from a great bottle of lemonade which he carries on his back, and from another we buy some of the Turkish fig paste for which Constantinople is famous. Now we have left the bridge and are making our way through the city. The streets are narrow and winding. They are paved with cobblestones, and in many places are dirty and filthy. What a lot of dogs there are everywhere! Many lie asleep on the stones, so that we have to kick them to get them out of our way. They put their tails between their legs and move off growling, for they are poor spirited curs, and are perhaps the leanest dogs of the world. They excite a pathetic interest, for they have no masters. They belong to the city, and their only homes are the streets. The Turks never think of letting dogs come into their houses, for they consider them unclean, so that, although Constantinople has thousands of dogs, no man in the city owns a dog. Each dog has its own quarter, however, and when a stray cur comes into a strange alley, the dogs of the alley pounce upon him and drive him out. The dogs serve as the scavengers, and they seem to be the only street cleaners of Constantinople. But here we are at the bazaars, where we can learn how they do business in this great Mohammedan city. We push our way through the crowds at the entrance and enter a town of stores, all under one roof. There are acres upon acres of little cell-like shops ranged along narrow cobblestone streets, lighted here and there by small domes. Some of the stores are not bigger than packing boxes. Here is one so small that it is entirely filled by the merchant, who sits cross-legged on the floor with his goods piled around him. Other shops are larger, and many are furnished with divans, upon which long-gowned, long-bearded men sit and smoke and drink coffee as they bargain. The floors of some of the stores are as high as a chair, and we sit on the floor with our feet in the street as we shop. All business is done by bargaining, and it takes us a long time to make every purchase. It is customary to find fault with the goods, and at the suggestion of our guide we offer only about one-third the amount that the merchant demands. If he refuses, we come up a few cents, and if he will make no reduction whatever, start away expecting to be called back, as is often the case, although he protests that such sales will ruin his business. There are no fixed prices, and the Turkish dealer takes all he can get. In many of the bazaars, the turbaned storekeeper sends out a servant for coffee, and we drink as we bargain. The coffee is served without cream in a little cup no bigger than half an eggshell. It is as thick as chocolate and almost as sweet as molasses. We are told that it is made of the roasted coffee beans pounded to a fine powder. We grow very fond of it, although it seems more like a sweet syrup than coffee. We devote a long time to the bazaars, strolling about through one narrow street after another. Each section has its own kind of goods. We walk through roofed alleys walled with slippers and shoes of the brightest of colors, and of all grades and prices. There are men's shoes of red leather made without heels, and with the toes turned up at the ends, like an old-fashioned skate. There are ladies' shoes of fine silk in the most delicate shades of pearl, pink, and sky blue, some of which are covered with gold and silver embroidery. We each buy a pair of children's shoes to take home. They are of red leather, with a tassel of wool on each toe as big as a walnut. Under the tassel is a bell, so that some of the little Turks actually go about with bells on their toes. We stay some time in the Persian bazaars, looking at beautiful shawls and other things from that country, buy a fez cap apiece in the fez shops, and in the perfumery section lay in a supply of attar of roses, for this is the land of that delightful perfume. In European Turkey there are vast rose farms, each containing many thousands of bushes. The roses are picked when in full bloom, and from their leaves is extracted an oil, the scent of which is so strong that a drop of it put into a box of clothing will make it smell like roses for weeks. This oil is called attar of roses. Vast quantities of it are sold in Constantinople, and a great deal is exported to other parts of the world. Passing through the spice bazaar, we enter streets where scores of merchants are selling the oriental carpets and rugs for which Turkey is famous. The rugs are made on hand looms by the women and girls in different parts of the empire. The work is done in their homes, and it takes them a long time to make a fine rug. Only a few square inches can be made in one day, and the larger rugs require many months of continuous work. End of chapter 37. Chapter 38 of Geographical Reader, Europe, by Frank G. Carpenter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Betty B. Chapter 38, Among the Mohammedans. Our first business this morning is to learn something of the Turkish Empire and how it is governed. We leave our hotel and go to the Sublime Porte, a vast building which contains the chief public offices of the Sultan. We are met at the door by the guards, one of whom takes us through room after room filled with clerks, each wearing a turban or a red fez cap on his head. Some wear European clothes, and a few have on long gowns like the merchants of the bazaars. The Empire of Turkey is ruled by the Sultan and a parliament of 2 houses, which is elected by the people. The Sultan has a council of ministers much like the cabinet of our president. His chief officer, who has charge of all civil affairs, is called the Grand Vizier, and another very great man is the Sheikh ul Islam, or chief of the church, who has to do with all matters relating to the Mohammedans in Constantinople and throughout the empire. Not only is the Sultan the civil ruler of the Turkish people, but he is the head of the Mohammedan religion, which is professed by more than 100 million people in different parts of the world. The Turkish Empire once included a large part of Asia, Africa, and Europe, but now it covers a territory only about a third as large as the United States. The European possessions of the Turks have for years been steadily decreasing. Country after country has been taken from them by Russia and Austria, and the Sultan is now able to hold Constantinople and his remaining territories north of the Bosporus only by the consent of the great powers who fear Russia and think Europe will be safer from her as long as the entrance to the Black Sea is in the hands of the Turks. All the countries of European Turkey combined are not so large as some of our western states. They now comprise only a part of the Balkan Peninsula, a rich land inhabited by many different peoples, much like those we saw on our trip down the Danube. There are Romanians, Servians, Bulgarians, Slavs, Albanians, Armenians, Gypsies, and a great many Turks. About 1/2 of the whole population is Mohammedan, and of the other half the most belong to the Greek Orthodox Church, which we learned about during our travels in Russia. The people throughout the whole Turkish Empire are poor. The Sultan and his officials prey upon them by demanding large taxes. The laws provide that 1/10 of all the crops shall go to the government, and the officials come out to the harvest fields and carry away their share of the grain. There are also heavy taxes on imports and exports, so that the people cannot save money. Men will not work hard in a country where the government takes the lion's share of the profits. The result is that there are comparatively few industries in Turkey, and the minerals and other resources are but little developed. In European Turkey the people live chiefly by farming and stock raising. They dwell in villages, having but few large towns, and only about a dozen cities of more than 20,000 inhabitants. The largest city outside Constantinople is Saloniki. It is on the Aegean Sea and has a railroad connection with other parts of Europe. It has an excellent harbor and is becoming a commercial port, as it is on the shortest sea route from London to the Suez Canal. Another important city is Adrianople, situated where the road from Constantinople to Vienna crosses that from Bulgaria to the sea. It is also the center of the rose growing industry, where the attar of roses we bought in the bazaar is made. We observe that education is backward in Turkey. The chief teachers are the Mohammedan priests, and the schools are largely connected with the mosques, or Mohammedan churches. Very few of the cities have any modern improvements, and everything is somewhat Asiatic. European Turkey is a Mohammedan country, ruled by Mohammedans, and all of our surroundings show the evil effects that Mohammedanism has upon the people and their advancement in civilization and wealth. But let us go to the mosques and see something of this interesting religion, which is professed by about 1/15 of the population of the globe. There are more than 2,000 mosques in the Turkish Empire, and about 300 of the finest of them are in Constantinople. Our first visit is to Santa Sophia, the largest mosque of the world. It was built as a Christian church centuries ago. 10,000 masons worked upon it for 7 years, and 100 architects were required to oversee its construction. It had doors of ivory, amber, and cedar, and its altar was made of precious stones embedded in gold. The finest temples of Ephesus, Thebes, Athens, and Rome were robbed of columns in order to decorate it, and it was a huge mass of precious marbles, gold, and jewels. When the Turks conquered Constantinople, they destroyed much of its beauty. They defaced the paintings and tore down the altars and turned it into a mosque. Nevertheless, it is still one of the most interesting of the world's churches and one of the largest. It covers almost as much ground as the Capitol at Washington, being built in the shape of a Greek cross. It is covered with a vast roof upheld by a forest of columns with a grand dome in the center. But let us go in and see for ourselves. We shall first enter the court. There are turbaned, long-gowned Turks guarding the doors, and we are asked to take off our shoes. For the Mohammedans consider their churches holy, and no one is permitted to enter them with his shoes on. There are fountains in the court, and about them are hundreds of Turks washing themselves before they go in to pray. The good Mohammedan prays 5 times every day, and he washes his face, hands, and feet before every prayer. We walk through corridor after corridor of the great mosque, and later attend one of the evening services, held in the light of its thousands of lamps. We stand in the galleries above great stars of flame, which seem to be floating in the air between the dome and the floor. Every pillar and every alcove is ablaze, and the galleries are walled with fire. The service has already begun when we enter the building. The floor below us is covered with worshippers. There are at least 5,000 Mohammedans on their knees, with their faces toward Mecca, on the floor below us. In turbans and gowns, with their shoes in front of them, and their bare feet turned up to the gallery, they form long lines of color upon the white mats away down there under the floating flames. They are all praying in response to the shrill cries of the imam, or priest, who stands in the pulpit at one end of the vast church and leads the service. He utters a sentence, and the long lines of turbaned men below us rise and fall like clockwork in their devotions. During our stay in Constantinople, we visit the seraglio, in which is the old treasury of the Sultan, and later we drive out past the palace of Yildiz, where His Majesty lives. His grounds contain many acres of forests and gardens, in which are ravines, lakes, and babbling brooks, for he has a large income, although his people are so poor. He has altogether over 30 palaces and keeps thousands of servants. There are 100 porters, for instance, and it takes hundreds of cooks to prepare the food for the palace. In the Sultan's stables there are 2,000 horses, and the finest of all the Arabian horses are sent to him. He has many slave girls as wives, according to law, and formerly the most beautiful women that could be found in Georgia and other parts of the Caucasus Mountains region, where the women are noted for their beauty, were bought and brought here to be members of his immediate family. According to the Mohammedan law, every true believer has the right to 4 wives, although most Mohammedans, for several reasons, have only one. One reason is that the better class women do but little work, and only a rich man can support several wives. Another reason, so the Turks tell us, is that with one wife a man may have peace in his family, but that more than one often bring trouble and discord. When we visit the Mohammedans in their homes, only the girls of our party are permitted to go into the women's apartments. It is not polite for a man to ask after the wives and daughters of his friends. The sexes are kept apart, and a young man seldom sees his betrothed until the wedding. The marriage is all arranged by the parents, and the young people are supposed to take without question whomsoever their fathers and mothers select. In many Mohammedan families the men and women do not eat together, nor do they associate with one another at parties, and, as we have seen, whenever a woman goes about on the street, she keeps her face well covered. The Turks are very polite. They are continually making elaborately courteous remarks to one another. When we meet them they accost us by saying in Turkish, "May thy day be happy," and if we would be as polite as they are, we must reply, "May thy day be happy and blessed." They are very hospitable, and we are frequently asked out to dinner. They usually eat but 2 meals a day, one at 10 o'clock in the morning and the other at sunset, although they may take a cup of coffee on rising. They do not use tables, but have their meals served on trays, some of which are as large around as a wash tub. In the center of each tray is a mat, on which the hot dishes are put with the salt, pepper, pickles, and other such things about them, new trays being brought in with the different courses. At a real Turkish meal, in the interior, every person has his own spoon, and helps himself to the soup in his turn. Meat and other viands are often brought on cut in small pieces, and are eaten with the fingers. The people are very dainty in using their fingers, touching the food only with the thumb and 2 first fingers, or dipping it out with a piece of bread doubled up and held in the hand. One Turk being asked if he did not think our way was more cleanly, he said, "Every one knows whether he has washed his fingers, but you can never tell who washes the knives and forks." We find the food very good. One of the most common dishes is pilaf, made of rice and chopped meat stewed together. This is served at almost every dinner, and when well cooked is delicious. We enjoy the Turkish fig paste and the nougat, or candy of nuts and sugar, and also the rose jam, which the servant brings in with a glass of water and a spoon. We eat the jam in the approved Turkish fashion, taking first a spoonful of jam and then a swallow of water, which dissolves the jam and leaves a taste of perfume in the mouth. End of chapter 38.